I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba to introduce an address by the head of state.
Señor Presidente.
President, Secretary General, distinguished delegates, as we mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the role of this body is increasingly relevant at a time when humanity is confronting such unexpected and exceptional circumstances. Only multilateralism, solidarity, and shared cooperation will allow us to overcome the major global challenges both of the present and of the future. In this spirit and understanding, it is my honor to present to you the pre-recorded message of His Excellency the President of the Republic of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez. Thank you very much.
Señor Secretario General, Señor Presidente.
Secretary General, President. A global pandemic has changed everyday life drastically. Almost overnight, millions of people have been infected and thousands have died, even when their life expectancy should be longer, thanks to progress in development. Hospital systems with high-level services have collapsed, and the health structures of poor countries are affected by their chronic lack of capacity. Drastic quarantines are turning the most populated cities into deserts. Social life is non-existent except on digital networks. Theatres, discos, galleries and even schools are closed or being reimagined. Our borders have been closed, our economies are shrinking and our reserves are dwindling. Life is undergoing a radical redesigning of age-old ways, and uncertainty is replacing certainty. Even close friends are unable to recognize one another due to the masks that we have to wear to protect us from contagion. Everything is changing. Much like the urgent need to find a solution to the pandemic, there is an urgent need to democratize this crucial organization, the United Nations, so that it effectively meets the needs and aspirations of all peoples. The sought-after right of humanity to live in peace and security with justice and freedom, the basis for unity among nations, is constantly under threat. Over $1.9 trillion are being squandered today in a senseless arms race promoted by the aggressive and warmongering policies of imperialism, whose leader is the present government of the United States, which accounts for 38% of current global military expenditure. We are referring to a markedly aggressive and morally corrupt regime that despises and attacks multilateralism, uses financial blackmail in its relations with United Nations system agencies, and that, in a show of unprecedented arrogance, has withdrawn from the World Health Organization, UNESCO, and the Human Rights Council. Paradoxically, the very country in which the headquarters of the United Nations is located is also walking away from fundamental international treaties such as the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. This host country rejects the nuclear agreement with Iran reached by consensus. It promotes trade wars. It scraps its commitment to international disarmament control instruments. It militarizes cyberspace. It expands coercion and unilateral sanctions against those who do not bend to its designs, and sponsors the forcible overthrow of sovereign governments through non-conventional war methods. Together with such action, which thumbs its nose at the long-standing principles of peaceful coexistence and respect of the right of others to self-determination as the bedrock for peace, the Donald Trump administration is also manipulating, for subversive aims, cooperation in the spheres of democracy and human rights, while in its own backyard there is an explosion of practically unchecked expressions of hatred, racism, police brutality, and irregularities in the election system and in the voting rights of citizens. There is an urgent need, as I've said, to reform the United Nations. This powerful organization, which emerged after the loss of millions of lives in 2 world wars, and as a result of a global understanding of the importance of dialogue, negotiation, cooperation, and international law, must not put off any further its modernization and democratization. Today's world needs the United Nations in just the same way as the world in which the United Nations was born did. Something very special and profound is foundering, as evidenced by the daily and permanent violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter and by the ever-increasing use or threat of use of force in international relations. There is no way to keep in place any longer, as if it were part of the natural and immutable order of things, an unequal, unjust and anti-democratic international order, an order where selfishness prevails over solidarity, and the mean interests of a powerful minority over the legitimate aspirations of millions of people. Notwithstanding the dissatisfactions and the demands for change that, together with other states and millions of citizens around the world, we are presenting to the United Nations, the Cuban Revolution will always champion the existence of this organization, to which we owe the meagre but nonetheless indispensable multilateralism that has been able to withstand overweening and overbearing imperialism. More than once in this very forum, Cuba has reiterated its willingness to work for the democratization of this House and for the upholding of international cooperation, for which the best defense is the United Nations itself. As stated by the first Secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, Army General Raúl Castro Ruz, and I quote, "The international community can always count on Cuba's honest voice in the face of injustice, inequality, underdevelopment, discrimination and manipulation, and for the establishment of a more just and equitable international order which really centres on human beings, their dignity and well-being." End of quote. President, turning my attention back to the seriousness of the present situation, which many blame solely on the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it is essential to say that the impact of this pandemic extends far beyond the health sphere. Due to its nefarious consequences, the staggering death toll and the damage it has wrought on the world economy, together with the deterioration of social development, the spreading of the pandemic over the last few months has brought in its train anguish and despair that has affected leaders and citizens in practically all nations. But the multidimensional crisis it has unleashed clearly shows the great failings of the dehumanized policies imposed by the dictates of the market. Today, we are sorrowing witnesses of the disaster that the world has been brought to by the irrational and unsustainable production and consumption that is part of the system of capitalism. We have also been brought to this brink by decades of an unjust international order and the implementation of ruthless and rampant neoliberalism, which has widened inequalities and sacrificed the right of peoples to development. Unlike discriminatory neoliberalism, which tosses aside and discards millions of human beings and condemns them to survive on the leftovers from the banquet enjoyed by the richest 1%, the COVID-19 virus does not discriminate. Rather, its devastating economic and social effects will be lethal among the most vulnerable and those with lower income, as whether they live in the underdeveloped world or in the pockets of poverty to be found in the major industrial cities of the world. According to projections of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, the 690 million people who were already going hungry in 2019 might be joined by a further 130 million this year as a result of the economic recession caused by the pandemic. Studies by the International Labour Organization, the ILO, claim that over 305 million jobs have been lost and that the livelihoods of more than 1.6 billion workers are at stake. We cannot deal with COVID-19, hunger, unemployment, and the growing economic and social inequalities between individuals and countries as unrelated phenomena. There is a pressing need to implement integrated policies that prioritize human beings over economic profits or political gain. It would be a crime to postpone decisions that should have been taken yesterday and indeed must be taken no later than today. It is vital that we promote solidarity and international cooperation to lessen the impact of the phenomena we're witnessing. Only the United Nations, with its world membership, has the required authority and reach to resume the just struggle to write off the unpayable foreign debt, which, aggravated by the social and economic effects of the pandemic, is threatening the very survival of the peoples of the global south. President, the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak and the early signs that it would bring a pandemic did not catch Cuba off guard. With the decade-long experience of facing terrible epidemics, some of which were provoked deliberately as part of the permanent war waged against our political project in Cuba, we immediately implemented a series of measures based on our main capabilities and strengths, namely a well-structured socialist state that cares for the health of its citizens, a highly skilled human capital, and a society which involves the majority of citizens in its decision-making and problem-solving processes. The implementation of those measures, combined with the knowledge accrued over 60 years of great efforts to create and expand a high-quality and universal health system, plus scientific research and development, has made it possible not only to preserve the right to health of all citizens without exception, but also to be in a better position to face the pandemic. We have been able to do this in spite of the harsh restrictions of the long-running economic, commercial and financial blockade being imposed by the US government, a blockade which has been brutally tightened over the last 2 years, even in these times of the pandemic, something that shows that it is a key component of the hostile US-Cuba policy. The aggressiveness of the blockade has reached a qualitatively higher level that further underscores its role as the real and determining impediment to the management of the economy and the development of our country. The US government has in particular intensified its harassment of Cuban financial transactions and, as of 2019, has been adopting measures that violate international law to deprive the Cuban people of the possibility to buy the fuel they need for their everyday activities and in order to be able to pursue their development. In order to damage and demonize the Cuban Revolution and others it defines as adversaries, the US has been publishing spurious lists lacking legitimacy by which it arrogates to itself the right to impose unilateral coercive measures and unfounded assessments on the world, obliging others to abide by them. Every week, that government, the government of the US, issues statements attacking Cuba or imposes new restrictions. Paradoxically, however, it has refused to term as terrorist the attack that was carried out against the Cuban embassy in Washington on April the 30th, 2020, when an individual armed with an assault rifle fired over 30 rounds at the diplomatic mission of Cuba and later admitted to his intent to kill. We denounce the double standards of the US government in the fight against terror and demand a public condemnation of that brutal attack. We demand a cessation of the hostile and slanderous campaign against the altruistic work of Cuba's international medical cooperation that, with much prestige and verifiable results, has contributed to saving hundreds of lives and lowering the impact of the disease in many countries. Prominent international figures and highly prestigious social organizations have acknowledged the humanitarian work undertaken by the Henry Reeve International Medical Brigade for disaster situations and serious epidemics and called for the Nobel Peace Prize to be awarded to this body. Whilst the US government is ignoring the call to pool efforts to fight the pandemic and withdraw from the WHO, Cuba, in response to requests made to it and guided by the profound solidarity and humanitarian vocation of its people, is expanding its cooperation by sending over 3,700 cooperation workers distributed between 46 medical brigades to 39 countries and territories hit by COVID-19. In this sense, we condemn the gangster-like blackmailing by the US seeking to pressure the Pan American Health Organization so as to turn that regional agency into a tool for its obsessive aggression against our country. Undoubtedly, the forces of truth shall cast down lies, and the facts and the actions of protagonists shall go down in history unburnished and available for all to see. Cuba's example shall prevail. Our dedicated health workers, the pride of a nation, raised on José Martí's idea that my country's humanity shall be awarded the prize their noble hearts deserve. Or perhaps not. It has been years since they won the recognition of the peoples blessed by their health work, which is a greater prize to win. The US government is flaunting its intention to enforce new and harsher aggressive measures against Cuba in the next few months. We state once again before the international community that our people who take pride in their history and are committed to the ideals and achievements of the revolution shall resist and overcome. President, the attempts to impose neo-colonial domination on our America by publicly declaring that the Monroe Doctrine still applies today contravenes the proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. We wish to restate publicly in this virtual forum that the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela shall always enjoy the solidarity of Cuba in the face of attempts to destabilize and subvert constitutional order and civic military unity, and to destroy the work started by Commander Hugo Chavez Frias and continued by President Nicolás Maduro Moros to benefit the Venezuelan people. We also reject U.S. actions aimed at destabilizing the Republic of Nicaragua and reaffirm our unwavering solidarity with Nicaragua's people and government led by Commander Daniel Ortega. We state our solidarity with the Caribbean nations, which are demanding just reparations for the horrors of slavery and the slave trade in a world where racial discrimination and repression against Afro-descendant communities have been on the rise. We reaffirm our historical commitment to the self-determination and independence of the sisterly people of Puerto Rico. We support the legitimate claim by Argentina to its sovereignty over the Malvinas, the South Sandwich and South Georgia Islands. We reiterate our commitment to peace in Colombia and the conviction that dialogue between the parties is the road to achieving stable and lasting peace in that country. We support the search for a peaceful and negotiated solution to the situation imposed on Syria, with no foreign interference and in full respect for Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We demand a just solution to the conflict in the Middle East, which must include the real exercise by the Palestinian people of the inalienable right to build their own state within the borders prior to 1967 and with East Jerusalem as its capital. We reject Israel's attempts to annex more territories in the West Bank. We state our solidarity with the Islamic Republic of Iran in the face of an escalation of U.S. aggression. We reaffirm our unshakable solidarity with the Sahrawi people. We strongly condemn the unilateral and unjust sanctions against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We restate our rejection of the intention to expand NATO's presence up to the borders of the Russian Federation and similarly reject the imposition of unilateral and unjust sanctions against Russia. We reject foreign interference into the internal affairs of the Republic of Belarus and reiterate our solidarity with the legitimate president of that country, Alexander Lukashenko, and with the sisterly people of Belarus. We condemn the interference into the internal affairs of the People's Republic of China and oppose any attempt to harm that country's territorial integrity and its sovereignty. President, today's disturbing circumstances have led to the fact that for the first time in the 75-year-long history of the United Nations, we have had to meet virtually. Cuba's scientific community, another source of pride for the nation that, since the triumph of the revolution of the just, announced to the world its intention to be a country of men and women of science, that scientific community is working non-stop on one of the first vaccines that are going through clinical trials anywhere in the world. The creators of that vaccine and other researchers and experts, in coordination with our nation's healthcare system, are writing protocols on healthcare for the treatment of infected persons, for recovered patients, and the at-risk population that have allowed us to maintain epidemic statistics of around 80% of infected persons enjoying a full recovery with their lives saved, and a mortality rate that is well below the average in the Americas and the world. Doctors, and not bombs. That was the pronouncement uttered one day by the historical leader of the Cuban Revolution and chief sponsor of scientific development in Cuba, Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruz. That is our motto. Saving lives and sharing what we are and what we have, no matter what sacrifice it demands, this is what we are offering to the world as we address the United Nations. And all we are seeking in return is a United Nations attuned to the gravity of the present moment. We are Cuba. Let us strive together to promote peace, solidarity and development. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Cuba for the statement just made.